Good afternoon, everybody from Cambridge, Massachusetts. My name is Emily Channel Justice. I'm the director of the Temirty Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute here at Harvard University. Thank you so much for joining our next event in the series, Decolonizing Ukrainian Studies, which I'm co-hosting here with Natalia Shpilova-Said, who is our preceptor in Ukrainian at Harvard. For those of you who have joined our previous sessions, you know that this session is designed to introduce and bring to this audience the bigger conversation about decolonization that's happening about Ukrainian studies, but more broadly in the field of Slavic studies. And as an anthropologist and as someone who's very deeply concerned about this conversation, I'm really delighted that today our speaker is Greta Lynn-Yuling. She's, like me, a cultural anthropologist and who has studied war, conflict, and population displacement, especially with a focus on the everyday lives of civilians. She's a professor at the University of Michigan, and she currently teaches seminars for the program in international and comparative studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And today we'll be focusing on her book, Decolonizing Ukraine, which focuses on the experience of Crimean Tatars in particular to talk about this conversation of decolonizing. And what I think we'll get out and we'll focus on in the conversation is some of the major trends in the studies, in Indigenous studies, kind of more broadly, and how that's relevant to Ukraine and to the Crimean Tatar population specifically. You may have also read her book, Everyday War, which came out in 2023 and was the winner of the Davis Center Book Prize. And she also is the author of a previous book about Crimean Tatars, Beyond Memory, The Crimean Tatars Deportation and Return. In terms of the format, Greta will tell us all about her book first, and then we'll open the question and answer session. If you're here in the audience and you'd like to submit a question via the Q&A function, we will get to as many as possible, and we look forward to your questions. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and especially thank you so much, Greta, for joining us and for sharing your excellent new book.
Thanks for having me. Okay, can you see the presentation okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. Let's get started. Okay, so Decolonizing Ukraine takes readers into the lives of the Ukrainians, Russians, Crimean Tatars who experienced the Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014. I focus in particular on the Crimean Tatars because they were among the most affected, among the least protected, and because they offer such a valuable aperture on Ukraine as a whole. I want to talk about the cover just a little bit because it really functions sort of as a visual heuristic for the book's argument as a whole. It was designed in collaboration with Mari Kinovich, drawing on Orniak, those vegetal and geometric designs that are shared across Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian visual traditions. And in the upper register, you'll see the outline of the Crimean Peninsula anchoring the design geographically and politically. At the center is a pomegranate, a symbol of collective well-being, kinship, fertility in the Crimean Tatar tradition. And I think most revealing is the element that registers last, if at all, the yellow Crimean Tatar tamga, which is a hereditary clan sign that has become part of the contemporary Crimean Tatar flag. So this cover is really staging visual argument that mirrors the book's claims that Crimea and Crimean Tatars are often present within narratives about Ukraine, but only like belatedly, obliquely, partially erased. And in bringing these elements into a single aesthetic field, the cover materializes the book's claim that we need to see Crimea and Crimean Tatars as part of the whole. So the kind of colonialism that interests me in this book is specifically settler colonialism. And in a minute, I'll say more about what I mean by that. So I created this graph for the book based on the census data to dramatize basically the effect of settler colonialism statistically. So prior to the Russian annexation, the imperial annexation in 1783, Crimean Tatars made up the overwhelming majority of the population, and their language served as the lingua franca peninsula. And so at that time, as you can see on the graph, the Slavic presence in the region was minimal. And those relative proportions changed as a result of Russian, Soviet, and eventually independent Ukrainian policy. So I think that it's important here that Ukraine, when it came into independence, inherited state borders, it inherited sovereignty, but not the tools to dismantle that Soviet legacy. The process of settler colonialism was accentuated by the 2014 occupation, which was called a hybrid deportation by Crimean Tatars because so many had no choice but to flee for their safety. They were motivated by egregious human rights abuses, enforced disappearances, politically motivated arrests, a legal landscape that prohibited freedom of speech or use of some religious texts. So estimates vary. Most come in around 35 or 45,000, perhaps half of whom were Crimean Tatars. And the effect of those departures were magnified by the immigration of Russian citizens. Estimates vary between 800,000 and 1 million moving to the Crimean Peninsula, which is, of course, averaged over the last decade a population of just over like 2.25 million. So I think the graph really provides a sort of statistical encapsulation of the significance of indigeneity. And Indigenous people, as defined by the United Nations, are descended from pre colonial ancestors, have survived economic and political marginalization, and remain vulnerable to exploitation by politically more dominant groups. So, Indigenous status, to my way of thinking, is not only an ethnic category, but a historical one that has ethical implications. Moving from the effects of settler colonialism to the logic, I think it reveals sort of like this project of elimination and replacement. And it was inspired here by Patrick Wolf, who wrote about the elimination of the native. I think his work definitely explicitly elevates the significance of indigeneity. And I think that although both Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars have been the target of settler colonialist policies, there's a difference in the tenor towards these groups because Crimean Tatars have been viewed through an Orientalist gaze that constructed them not as a so-called little brother, but as dangerous and uncivilized. So in Patrick Wolf's formulation of settler colonialism, it's understood sort of as a durable structure that comes to organize power, law, representation. And so it's more than exploitation because the settler society seeks to normalize themselves as native. And I'm sure we've all seen lots of discourses to that effect. The Crimean Tatars' relationship to territory operates according to a different logic. Land is less a resource than a responsibility. And rather than treating land as an external object to be claimed, Crimean Tatars see themselves as constituted by the land materially and metaphysically. So bones and flesh are formed from the soil. The atoms that circulate in the body come from the figs, pears, and kizzleberries that are in turn nourished by Crimean unique atmosphere. And so it's important to avoid romanticizing Crimean Tatars through like some sort of primitivist trope of noble savagery. We can note that this logic is non-expropriative, and a non-expropriative orientation is less prone to the kind of expansionist violence that we see with settler colonial logic. So as one person phrased it, I don't want anything that isn't ours. What we want is our own land back. So this has an epistemic legacy. And just to relate to you a story from Bakhchisarai, I went to visit Bakhchisarai not long before the 2014 occupation. This was in 2013. And I wanted to see the Khan's Palace developments there because the Khan's Palace is one of the few landmarks that was not destroyed by the Crimean Tatars' exile in 1944. Of course, it is now again under occupation, endangered. So as my driver and I bumped up the potholed roads, we exchanged some friendly banter. And when we passed a construction site, he lamented that the movie theater was being turned into a mosque. And so I nodded and I said, well, what was it before? It was a movie theater. And he thought for a little while, probably a mosque. And so my field notes are filled with notes like these that point to a disassociation from the reality. People knew that the Crimean Tatars had been unjustly exiled from the peninsula, but that awareness was sequestered in a separate mental space. And this results in a sort of compartmentalization of history in which past practices are kept separate, even as they shape present day racial, social, and political realities. So, just one example, when returning to independent Ukraine, Crimean Tatars were often plied with exaggerated accounts of their Nazi sympathies, but not the orders that had later cleared their name. So I'm just trying to say that the epistemic legacy is an occlusion of knowledge, not forgetting per se, but a dissociation from inconvenient truths like the Crimean Tatars' previous majority status peninsula. So the images on the right of the screen show the the sort of material effects of the inherited institutions, infrastructures, and habits of mind. I don't want to spend too much time talking about Crimea as part of independent Ukraine, except to call attention to the epistemic erasure involved in the use of ancient Muslim graves as building material and road pavement. On the right, you see how a Muslim gravestone has been embedded in the wall of a public restroom. So in this book, decolonization entails dismantling colonialist epistemologies so as to reclaim subject positions, political agency, perspective, and relationships to land, to history, to one another. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o reminds us, decolonization is a search for a liberatory perspective. And I think thinking with and through indigeneity is a way to pursue that project. I'm especially interested in the cognitive and self-referential dimensions here. So one of the book's central interventions in the decolonial literature on Eastern Europe is to argue that Ukraine is simultaneously disentangling itself from Russian domination and aggression and revising its relationships with its indigenous people and its treatment of them. And so I basically am suggesting that decolonization requires two simultaneous lines of sight: undoing Imperial Russian domination and dismantling the hierarchies that were inherited from Russia and the Soviet Union. And so it entails asking a lot of questions like, why did Ukrainians mobilize the centuries-old tropes of the Crimean Tatars as inherently violent when they expressed surprise that it wasn't Crimean Tatars that had repelled Russian aggression in 2014 when the Ukrainian military had been unable? I do want to underscore that since 2014, the Ukrainian government has been remarkably successful and it has recognized Crimean Tatars. There's legislation recognizing the Crimean Tatars as rooted or indigenous. The 1944 exile has been recognized as a genocide. There is a 2021 law on indigenous people. And of course, the Zelensky administration has set up a number of bodies to oversee the relationship with indigenous peoples. Okay, so I think that all of these developments reflect an ability to concurrently disentangle from inherited effects and shed the residue embedded in the institutional practices. But I want to give an ethnic graphic example of like how and why that might be important. I think that Jamala's Eurovision victory in 2016 can be read as an enactment of these two lines of sight, this bifocality. In my personal interview with her, Jamala emphasized that she sang her song for the sake of emotion. And so, to her way of thinking, more than doing something, what she wanted was for other Ukrainians to feel something of what exile had meant for her people. And I think that this addresses the colonial aphasia that previously foreclosed integration of knowledge of the 1944 exile. And of course, her success with the song was far from assured because not all Ukrainians were familiar with the 1944 exile. Those that were may have also learned about Crimean Tatars from antiquated school books, that may have portrayed the Crimean Tatars as Ukraine's arch enemies, raiders and pillagers of Ukrainian villages, and the source of grief in the wild fields. But the lyrics of the song, which are about the 1944 exile, fill an epistemological gap created by active historical erasure, telescoping the Crimean Tatar past into the Ukrainian present at a moment that it could become speakable alongside other Soviet era oppressions like the state organized famine. And I think that Jamala was successful with her song because she intuited what political philosopher Judith Butler argues is this profound connection between grief and recognition and political community. So Jamala's victory really exemplifies this bifocal approach, pointing to Ukrainians' capacity to pursue decolonization vis-a-vis Russia and simultaneously revise its internal relations with indigenous people. Because I am interested in these cognitive and intersubjective dimensions, a question that's really at the center of the book is how a historically disadvantaged group not only survived genocide and repeated episodes of dispossession, but succeeded in transforming how they're viewed by others and how they view themselves, thereby gaining more meaningful social inclusion and political power in Ukraine. And the book explores this question both through the grievability that I just mentioned, but also through other modalities like the discourse on freedom, working with and through fear, and of course, the strengthening of resistant political subjectivities. So I think freedom is really important. The discourse on freedom operated at several different registers. One was, of course, as a value that sutured Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians together. And by extension here, freedom also performed this important work, acting as a means of drawing a sharp moral distinction between Ukrainian values and Russian ones. And this distinction is insignificant because, as Frantz Fanon and other scholars of colonialism argue, colonization often leaves its deepest marks through the internalization of the colonized's belief about power, obedience, legitimacy, worth. But among Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians, this discourse of freedom really underwrote a rejection, an inversion even of that received hierarchy. Another way that freedom operated was really as a practice, something that had to be actively cultivated. And in this respect, it was a way of being in the world that involved continually reaching beyond individuals' prior limitations. And this meant that the word victim really had to be placed in scare quotes to signal its inability to describe the complexity of their experience. I refer to this as the alchemy of adversity because I saw people continuously bracketing truly difficult circumstances in favor of embracing all of the affordances, the literal freedoms. There's another register of living in government controlled parts of Ukraine. And around this time, there were also many conversations about how the 1944 exile should not be allowed to become like the single story that's told about Crimean Tatars. A visual metaphor for this process can be found in the photo in the left-hand corner, the street art in southern Ukraine. The words at the top, Crimea is Ukraine, and then in the blue letters, you should be able to see got to be free in the blue letters. And before its destruction, this piece was oriented towards Russian-controlled Crimea. Read through Jean-Paul Sartre's argument, that an escape from objectification lies in turning back the gaze upon the one who's doing the objectifying. I think the artwork enacts kind of like a visual decoloniality in its orientation. But this de-objectification was, of course, not only symbolic, it's also evident in the Crimean barricade, which is, you see a picture in the lower left. This is where Ukrainians of a variety of backgrounds, led by Crimean Tatar, stopped the multi-million-dollar flow of goods, and this action rendered Russia's occupation costlier. There was also at this time the establishment of groups to monitor crossings of the administrative boundary line, further transforming those spaces that had been fraught with challenges into sites of collective oversight and greater safety. So I think that the barricade exemplifies claiming a resistant political subjectivity in action. It foregrounded an indigenous understanding of history not a resource but a responsibility to be upheld. And this was based on 1,000 years of history. And this indigenous history, it should be noted, was told by decentering the state, figuring multiple species from salmon and whales to goats and moles that could dramatize the relationships between beings in this landscape. The people on the barricade working with and through fear in a way that really placed Ukraine's territorial sovereignty above their personal safety, even before the full-scale invasion. So as a person on the barricade explained to me, he gave me this Crimean Tatar saying, "Do not be afraid of death, but a useless life." At the same time, however, the episode really reveals the fragility of acceptance of Crimean Tatars, because when the electricity pylons supplying Crimea were destroyed, responsibility was immediately ascribed to Crimean Tatars despite the absence of evidence or claims of responsibility. And the speed with which the stereotypes of Crimean Tatars as inherently violent or seditious, the speed with which they were reactivated underscores there's still sort of a through line of sorts from the Crimean War to the Second World War to the present. Okay, so that gets me to why a decolonial lens now. This is a really great question, and I think that the study of Eastern Europe is in the middle of a shift in which we're searching for the best theoretical frameworks and tools. And in doing this research for the book, I really found myself sort of at a crossroads without a compass, because the literature on Indigenous people doesn't concern itself with Eastern Europe, and the literature on Eastern Europe engages Crimean Tatars, but it's usually as an ethnic minority. And I think that decoloniality was very helpful to me in really centering Indigenous experience and working with, but also through the ethno-national theorizing, because Indigenous people are really more than minorities having institutions of self-governance. And I can note here that the literature on Indigenous struggles for self-determination is quite focused on recognition, an idea that has its deepest origins in Western philosophy, right, with George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Johann Fichte, but really became much more well-known with Charles Taylor, who applied these ideas to multicultural societies to argue that granting recognition could be a way to secure stability among diverse groups in liberal democracies. But I think that, this idea of a polity granting a people something that should already be theirs reveals its inherent limitation. It sort of recapitulates a subordination in the very giving. And one of the things that was most striking in my research that pertains to working with and past ethno-national theorizing was the extent to which people who were displaced from Crimea built solidarities and affinity amongst themselves and found that they had more in common with one another than co-ethnics who remained in Crimea. So in seeking to theorize that, I explored that ethnographically through a variety of means. One of them was through their very powerful phenomenological sense that they had been displaced in time itself, also through damaged personal relationships and sensory experiences. So I can just touch on both of those very, very briefly. So a majority of the people I interviewed who had been displaced spoke about the disintegration of their personal relationships. And my transcripts are really replete with accounts of friend, family, and intimate partner relations that fractured after the 2014 occupation over accusations of political disloyalty that were being parsed, at least, as treason. And of course, This is less about real treason than a way to shame pro-Ukrainian sentiments in the pursuit of Russian political unity. Crimean Tatars were already familiar with the script. It had played out around them in the past, but for others, the Russians and Ukrainians who had fled, came as quite a surprise. And these disruptions don't make sense in the ethno-national theorizing through which Crimea has most often been understood. Quick anecdote to illustrate that point: a young man named Stepan, he was going through some donated clothing in a humanitarian shelter in Kherson, and he told me the story of how he and his father had gotten into an argument when his father learned he hadn't voted in the referendum about the status of Crimea. And his father, exclaimed that he was no longer his son, and Stepan felt fled as a result of that dispute. And I think that really part of the virulence of Russian occupation was this invasion and exploitation of private realms, and this power reorganizing social life in ways that are only really superficially ethnic. Now, decoloniality can't by any stretch of the imagination replace ethnicity, right? We don't want to jettison ethnicity as a lived experience or flatten the significance of Soviet nationalities policy, the importance of the Soviet socialist system. But it was important for me to think through this solidarity. And I think that, it was also evident in very embodied and sensory experiences in longing for a common Crimean home. So people of all backgrounds who fled Russian occupation often describe this process of becoming more aware of the interconnectedness of their personal and sensory experience of home with Crimean Tatar culture. So a woman of mixed Slavic heritage who grew up in Crimea described how a few weeks after fleeing Crimea, she went to a workshop for IDPs, and the facilitators asked her to draw something associated with home using all of her senses: taste, smell, touch, sight, sound. She started to draw, and she realized everything she drew was also Crimean Tatar. She drew things like a jezve, a Turkish-style coffee maker, and she wasn't alone in awareness that whatever her genetic heritage, her home was infused with this Crimean Tatar culture. And I think that this points to the potential for mutual recognition that inheres in forced displacement from Crimea. So maybe it was wood smoke, maybe it was coffee, pine bark, green figs. Those are just a few of the associations that people had of Crimea as a common home. I want to say that although the subjective experience of the internally displaced overlapped, it doesn't really diminish the significance of indigeneity, because too often the decolonization of Ukraine is taken to mean correcting for the dominance of Russian language, narratives of history, political power, without also considering the place and the people where Russia's war of aggression began. And so I think that decolonization stands to bring forms of mutual recognition that soften previously hardened accounts of difference into greater focus. And so I think that I will close there, and I look forward to people's comments and questions.
Wonderful, Greta. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing several of the ethnographic anecdotes that are placed throughout the book. I think that really gives everyone listening a good sense of the research and kind of how you approach such a complex topic when, of course, there's no possibility to actually go to Crimea right now. I think your ethnographic illustrations really add to that. So Natalia, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much, Greta, for this very thought-provoking presentation, and of course, congratulations on your book. So I would like to take a step back and go back to one of your slides, of course, that started with settler colonialism policies, and In that slide, you put in kind of one dimension Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and independent Ukraine. So, and I was wondering if you could speak more about that, if there were any differences or if there was anything significant that should be kept in mind while we talk about settler colonialism policies in that context. One of the reasons I ask is that it's kind of connected with my sub-question about how Crimean Tatars see Ukraine, because I think we also exercise this kind of epistemic privilege when we look at Crimean Tatars and try to understand how they are viewed. But what do they say about their affiliation with Ukraine? In 2014, I think many Ukrainians were kind of surprised that the Crimean Tatars chose to be with Ukraine. This kind of attitude that primarily till 2014, many Ukrainians thought that, well, as soon as Crimean Tatars would have this opportunity to be with Russia, they would go with Russia. And then in 2014, well, many were kind of, well, of course, pleasantly surprised, and embraced this kind of opportunity as well. But I'm wondering what they think about Ukraine. And again, well, I will share another conversation that I had at some point in 2016, in which one of the Crimean Tatars mentioned that in Ukraine we were able to be ourselves, but while the peninsula is occupied by Russia, we had to pretend to be something else, or someone else, sorry.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, well, I can't presume to speak for all Crimean Tatars, but what I would say is that, you know, the Crimean Tatar leadership in the form of the Majlis has always worked very closely with the Ukrainian central authorities and central government. And it was really only to their dismay that they didn't have greater recognition on the part of the central Ukrainian authorities in the first couple of decades of Ukrainian independence, right? So the Majlis was asked to register itself as a NGO, which eclipsed its conception of itself as an institution of indigenous governance and self-determination. So while they may have been frustrated with the Ukrainian central authorities' slowness to acknowledge them, I think that there has long been an alliance between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians through values, right? And the value of freedom is just one value, but I would foreground that as, you know, like absolutely central to why forging a stronger political community was so organic. And yeah, so and then the other thing I guess that I would add to that is that, you know, while the Crimean Tatar authorities have always strived to work closely with Ukrainian central authorities, it was very difficult for Crimean Tatars returning to the Crimean Peninsula as a part of independent Ukraine because of that, what I refer to, right, the colonial aphasia, the inability to quite integrate the knowledge that they had been unjustly displaced. And so it was very difficult to reintegrate the peninsula in the first 2 decades of Ukrainian independence, precisely because Ukraine lacked the tools to decolonize to inherit itself, right, from that Soviet legacy.
Would love to actually build on that. Natalia, if you wanted to go ahead and add anything, please do. But that was precisely kind of my question, because one of the things that I think you bring up in the text that is really important to talk about is the pressure on the Ukrainian state authorities to do this right. You just talked about the Majlis having this relationship that wasn't exactly what they wanted, but was obviously better than what they would get. Crimea was not part of Ukraine. One of the things you talk about a lot in the book is how the Ukrainian, especially under President Zelensky, the Ukrainian state has really put effort into this politics of recognition, into recognizing the claim of indigeneity, the claim of genocide. That suits the Ukrainian state's ends at this point in the process of trying to get Crimea deoccupied. What is the obligation for the state? Let's say that deoccupation is achieved. What would be the best case scenario in terms of the actions of the Ukrainian state to kind of succeed in a real recognition of a decolonization process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that the Ukrainian administration's steps in this regard are truly remarkable, given the fact that it is simultaneously defending itself militarily against Russian aggression and dealing with all of these very important matters. So there's a plan for that, right? Like there's a plan for the cognitive and material deoccupation that it takes into account fully indigenous people in terms of, renaming the places that had lost herd since the 2014 occupation. All of those things is part of the Ukrainian government. And I guess what I would add to that is the piece that Jamala emphasized to me, that right now it may not be about doing as much as feeling, right? That there are, corners of awareness that can still be open. So for example, the Bogardus scale that measures attitudes between different groups hasn't really changed that much. And in its last measure of how Ukrainians felt about Crimean Tatars, right? And so I think that Jamala's message is still relevant, that it's important for Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians to recognize how much they have in common in oppression during the Soviet era, in their values, and being co-inhabitants of this southern steppe area in the peninsula.
Thank you so much for the answer. And I really encourage the audience, if this is something that interests you, this kind of, really unique, I think, take that the Ukrainian authorities have made. I really think it's an interesting example and something that's worth continuing to monitor in I think, different methods. Natalia, do you have any additional questions?
I would like to again go back to the Soviet time period and to the disintegration of the Soviet Union and when Ukraine became independent. And as it was also mentioned that Ukraine lacked some tools for kind of embracing, right, the Crimean Tatars as part of the whole, as you put in your presentation. But on the other hand, there was also this heritage, Soviet legacy in terms of how Crimean Tatars were viewed. They were villainized, and unfortunately during the 1990s, probably not that much of scholarly work was produced in an attempt to somehow reconsider this vision. But would you talk a little bit about how this view may be changed at this point, or what other steps Ukrainians are undertaking right now to kind of explore how the relations between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians were developing? Because on the other hand, it's also another difference between how Ukrainians approach Crimean Tatars and how Russians approach Crimean Tatars as well.
Yes, so how Ukrainians are approaching this is quite multifaceted, I would say. There are very rich historical scholarship going on that seeks a deeper understanding of these people's relationship over time. There are artistic collaborations that are going on, musical collaborations, civic organizations and social organizations going on. So I think that, since the 2014 occupation of Crimea, the developments have been quite robust. But I think that what you really want to know is something more about during the Soviet era, right? So what I would say is that the Crimean Tatars were forcibly exiled in 1944. They were not allowed to return to the peninsula. In the very, very late Soviet period, the 1944 exile was recognized as unjust. And the Naev Commission in 1989 began to dismantle all of the policies that were in place that would prevent the Crimean Tatars from repatriating, right? And so when the Crimean Tatars repatriated throughout the 90s, really, they were formally accepted, but there were many different policies, not the least among them the Propiska system, the system of privatization of land that made establishing a presence on the peninsula quite difficult, to say the least. And so, during the Soviet era, for the most part, Crimean Tatars were in Uzbekistan and places of exile, lobbying for their return. And if you had visited Crimea during that era, you would have noted that it was quite Russified, but also that people from both parts of Russia and Ukraine had been moved into Crimea to occupy the land and the property that the Crimean Tatars had been dispossessed of.
But in terms of the present moment, of course, Crimea is not available right now at this point for travel and for doing some research. But from how things are as of right now, Russia is claiming that Crimea is not only Russia's, but Crimea is Russian. So how do you position your own research in this kind of narrative? What kind of contribution, right, we can somehow extract from your research to somehow debunk this kind of narrative that is getting more and more strong, where Russia actually, while focusing primarily on the 19th century, claims that Crimea is essentially Russian land. However, it has never been Russian. Even in the 19th century, when settlers were moving to the Crimean Peninsula, there are many archives that say that even the population would prefer the Crimean Tatar names for the geographical locations. And the Russians brought not only some, like factories or in the closer to the 20th century, in the 20th century, but they also brought a lot of destruction, erasing that kind of historical memory as well, or national memory or ethnic memory.
So, yes. I would say that what you're describing is precisely the logic of settler colonialism, right? Where the settler society wants more than to expropriate labor or resources, right? They want to replace the indigenous population and become the natives, right? And they do this discursively, they do it materially, they do it epistemically, they do it by manipulating history. There's many different modalities through which they have been working on this project. And one of them is, as I demonstrated with the graph, I believe that was the second slide, is population replacement. So they've got population replacement, they have historical discourse, they have language policy, and of course it's not true. And I explain in the book that, it's a Russian narrative. And what I try to do in the book really is sort of reposition the Crimean Tatar perspective on that and provide a glimpse of the Crimean Tatar political imaginary, which, from the Crimean Tatar perspective, they had a established state that lasted for over 300 years with institutions of governance. They controlled territory far beyond the Crimean Peninsula. And so if you look at these matters historically, particularly in the beginning chapters where foreground the Crimean Tatar political imaginary, we can see that the Russian story is the Russian story, right? And there's other ways of understanding this complex place.
Mm-hmm. There is a question that is somehow continues this kind of topic. And if I may, I would like to read this question. So by Kristina Pashchin Demyanchuk, apologies if I mispronounced the name. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I'm an academic and a director of a new feature documentary on Crimean Tatars' activities and their efforts to help protect mainland Ukraine and still reclaim Crimea during this current war, titled Etched in Memory. From what I've seen since 2022, most mainstream Western media have not really been covering the Crimean Tatar community, or only very superficially, even now as Trump gears up to recognize Crimea as Russian territory. Could you speak on the impact of Russian colonialist narratives on Western media and academia, and how Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians can potentially overcome some of this woeful ignorance in the West, let alone Islamophobic and Orientalist biases against them? How can we help them to decolonize Western media and academia in this respect?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. I think that you've answered your own question. You can create a documentary about Crimean Tatar culture and hope to dispel some of the mythology that surrounds them. I think that it is important, and this was sort of my point when I talked about the cover and what the book is trying to do, is to keep Crimean Tatars visible as part of the Ukrainian whole. And I think that I guess what I would say about that is, there's sort of how do I put this? There can be a confusion on the part of the media between the numerical significance of a group, their moral significance for the world as a whole, right? So I think one of the reasons that Crimean Tatars are continually sort of forgotten or eclipsed in narratives about the war is that they aren't like a significant proportion of the Ukrainian population, right? But if we go back to that image of the demography, right, that's the result of policy. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's important for the media not to confuse an ethical problem for a numerical one.
And I think that's a great way to put it. And I think one thing the US media misses a lot is the kind of domestic politics and how they're being debated in Ukraine today. And the platforming of Crimea is something that's been happening for more than 5 years now. And I think that got missed before the full-scale war, and it's definitely still being missed. And so, yeah, I just want to second what Greta said. Making a documentary about this is a great way to.
Yeah. And I also, I would be remiss if I didn't say that there are many, many, many Crimean Tatars who are so articulate about their own experience that really all you have to do is invite them into the conversation and make them part of the conversation. It's, so I think that is really the crucial step that needs to be taken, right? Like the American news media should be featuring Crimean Tatars alongside Ukrainians, right? When they're talking about the war. And it's kind of it's a classic oversight when it should be something that comes to mind immediately to, feature a variety of people. Like, I think that the American news media is a little bit better about doing that inside our country, and maybe less so when it comes to Ukraine, of like really foregrounding the diversity.
There is a brief question that is connected to this current discussion from Diego Benning Wong. Do you think indigenous toponyms in Crimea should be officialized?
I do. I think that it's part of how history is anchored to the landscape. And it is also part of how culture can be preserved. And so, the thing about the Crimean Tatar toponyms is that each one really anchors a story about, the bear who fell asleep, the angry soldier who threw his golden arrow into the Black Sea. And so the toponyms aren't just names in Crimean Tatar, but they also tell stories about values and culture and history and norms that are important to keep in focus, particularly since the Crimean Tatars are so knowledgeable about that environment. So something I talk about in the book is how, like right now, Crimea has a really terrible water problem, right? It has a very big water shortage. And the indigenous people, of course, have centuries of managing that with clay pipes. And they have centuries of managing the species that are grown there with certain methods of growing and cultivating very specific strains. And so the toponyms not only give respect to Crimean Tatar culture, but give us stories for moving into the future with.
Thank you for that detailed answer. We have so many great questions, so we will try to get to as many as we can. We have a sort of two-part question from Raymond Arendt, who you've sort of recognized this already, that returning to Crimea in general and getting back one's own lost property is different. We've talked about the occupation of people's houses, and that's a big theme in the book. So how has this issue impacted decolonization? But he also points out or wants to know more about the impact of the large part of the Russian population in Crimea being ex-Soviet military as opposed to civilians. But I think that speaks to a larger theme that you address in the book about the general militarization as part of occupation.
Crimea has very much been militarized, and it is the staging ground for many of the strikes that go into the continental part of Ukraine. And I think that it is a delicate question, but not, it's a delicate question about like what to do about questions of, for example, property, right? Like the Crimean Tatars were dispossessed of over 80,000 homes and over 34,000 hectares of land, right? And so I think that reparations and truth commissions are mechanisms that the international community is fairly skilled with. And when the time arrives that that's appropriate, those mechanisms could be, I think that, Crimean Tatars are more focused on adequate political representation and recognition of their indigenous organs of governance so that they can have self-determination over the matters that concern them, right? Their own internal matters. That is really a big focus for Crimean Tatars is governance.
Thank you so much. I'll ask you also to address Anastasia Lishtishin's question about the role of language in the broader discussion of decolonization. So she cites Volodymyr Kulik's survey research that demonstrates a general shift in the Ukrainian population from a preference for a preference for Russian to a preference for Ukrainian. Where do you see Crimean Tatars as a population fit into this, but also in respect of their promotion of their own indigenous language and the Ukrainian state's efforts to promote and protect the Crimean Tatar language as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Where the Crimean Tatars stand on this depends on where they are located, if they're in continental parts of Ukraine, government-controlled Ukraine, they follow those trends. If they're in Russian-occupied Crimea, they're operating in a very Russified environment. That said, of course, during the Soviet era, in Crimea, there were insufficient resources for learning both Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar, right? Like no mistake, both those groups were the target of this sort of ethos of replacement on the part of Russia. And so the institutions that will support language learning are being built. And I think really, one of the challenges right now is that there is a war going on, right? Like there's only so much that can be done, but yeah, I'm a big advocate for expanding the resources for native language learning.
Super, thank you. I agree. Those of you more interested in this question, during our last our TCOP conference a few weeks ago, Alim Aliyev also spoke a little bit about the role of Crimean Tatar language, so you can go back and listen to that as well. Let's see. We have a question here that kind of goes back, I think, to like the bigger framework of the book, and maybe you can speak a little bit about the extent to which scholarship on settler colonialism in other contexts, the person who wrote the question is thinking of Canada and Palestine, How might these have been relevant for your thinking about settler colonialism in Crimea? Are you considering comparative, theoretical, historical, ethnographic, and other research? And what contribution might that type of research make to understand settler colonialism generally and in Crimea?
Mm-hmm. So in doing the research for the book, I worked extensively with a scholar named Coutard, who works on Indigenous and government indigeneity in Canada, and also a scholar named Elliott. And basically, their take on the sort of the approach of looking for Indigenous recognition parallels my own. And I was very inspired by experiences in Canada that suggested that, this whole idea that if a polity suggests that they're going to grant recognition, it sort of resubordinates them in the very, in the concept that recognition is a gift, right? That relations need to be more equal as a starting point for a more productive dialogue between governments and settler communities. And so the work of Coutard and Elliott looking at Canada has paralleled my own work. I've also looked at some other, settler colonialism in other places, but I think I'll leave it on the Canadian topic because that was really the one that was most relevant for me.
Super, thank you. Natalia, would you like to choose a question?
Well, there are a few great questions, and I do hope that we will be able to get to all of them. But I would like to start with this one from Tatiana Dzadevich. Thank you very much for your presentation. If I may, I would like to ask, which topic is more important to focus on at this time? Should we address the damage done to Crimean Tatar cultural heritage and the broader issues affecting Crimea, or should we prioritize discussing human rights violations and the dangers faced by the Crimean Tatars on their own land?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. And I think that a lot of very valuable efforts are being made. So I really don't see a reason or a necessity to prioritize. Different people have different areas of specialty and knowledge and proclivity in terms of their scholarly interests. So I think that there's room for everybody to do the work that they see as most important.
There is another question that, in fact, goes back to the beginning of our discussion, particularly in terms of, again, speaking about settler colonialist policies, where we talked about the Russian Empire, Soviet time period, and independent Ukraine, while some viewers or listeners, and let me get Zarema Mustafaeva, she is reminding us about the many genocides that took place in Crimea during the Soviet time period on the one hand. On the other hand, we also have a comment from Olena Shust, if I'm not mistaken, who's saying Ukraine wasn't aggressive against Crimean Tatars, not Ukraine colonized Ukraine. So what about decolonization of Ukraine from Russia, which is really aggressive and oppressor? Isn't this the real priority? So I believe it's somehow connected to this kind of, speaking about all those three entities, while there are some atrocities done by specifically the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, then there are some other approaches that were developed by independent Ukraine, but still we think about these three entities in one dimension. So would you probably make a couple of comments on that and how we can either differentiate or not differentiate, or whether it's important to differentiate between different entities while we talk about settler colonialist policy in this case?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's very important to distinguish. I don't think I ever said that Ukraine was aggressive towards the Crimean Tatars, right? I don't see Ukraine or Ukrainians as some sort of colonial aggressor. the way I see it, like the way I see these three parties is that the independent Ukraine inherited Soviet institutions, which were informed by this Russian settler colonialism, right? And as such, it's both did not have the capacity during the first 2 decades of independence to recognize Crimean Tatar rights, right? And that's very different than seeing Ukraine as some kind of an aggressor. I'm saying Ukraine lacked the capacity to address these really important issues, and it lacked the capacity for a whole set of reasons. We could go into the economic crisis that was happening at the time. The supply chains of things like energy broke down around that time. We could go into, the political structures in Crimea. We could go into some of the sort of like the more epistemic things that I was trying to suggest, right? Which is like this, like thinking about Crimea and in Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians and in these very separate silos or categories. Basically, I don't see Ukraine as a colonialist aggressor. I see it as an inheritor of a very unfortunate legacy that perpetuated some of the structural violence against Crimean Tatars and can be repaired, right? Like it's easier to repair the infrastructure than it is the relationships. And so on the positive side of things, I think that, Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians have very constructive relationships with one another and the capacity to rebuild the kind of society that they want.
I can but mention this comment that includes Anastasia Levkova's novel, There is Land Behind Perekop. I'd like to mention Anastasia Levkova's novel, There is Land Behind Perekop, which I worked on at Laboratoria, where I serve as editor-in-chief. The novel enters Crimea and Crimean Tatar presence not as backdrop, but as a living historical and emotional landscape. In doing so, it challenges the long tradition of portraying the peninsula as exotic, empty, and merely geopolitical, and instead restores memory and voice, a profoundly decolonial gesture. My question is, if we work to decolonize Ukrainian studies, how can scholars and educators integrate contemporary literary works, foregrounding Crimean Tatar perspectives, not just as illustrations, but as sources of knowledge in their own right? And relatedly, what responsibilities do translators and international publishers bear when such works enter English and become key entry points for global understandings of Crimea and its indigenous history? And a short comment, the book is now being translated, yes, into English, and it will be published in Columbia Press shortly.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a great plug for There is Land Behind. I'm not sure what the question is. Obviously, everybody who writes about Crimea has ethical obligations. And I think that you may already be familiar with the project Crimean Fig, which was featured also, I believe, in this very same series. And people might want to refer to that interesting conversation about literature. I think that it's very difficult in a time of war to foreground Crimean Tatar voices from Crimea, because, this is a place where, by definition, you cannot freely express yourself, right? And there can be consequences for expressing a pro-Ukrainian opinion, right? Expressing a Muslim opinion, practicing certain kinds of Muslim Islam, reading some Islamic texts. So it's a very difficult time to do this, but it sounds like your project is trying to do just this.
Yeah, I think, for me, as somebody who has studied Ukraine for many years, I've found Crimean Tatar literature has been a big gap, I think, in what is accessible and kind of considered part of what should be studied and read. And so I'm obviously delighted that this book is being translated just a personal anecdote is that I'm slow at reading Ukrainian literature, but I've been working my way through this book and it's phenomenal.
Maybe we can have some optimistic, I don't know, attitude to close our session today, but well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually don't see that as, really outside the scope of my research at all, because as I talk about like the effect of patriotic education on children in Crimea was profound, so profound that a lot of people fled purely to remove their children from an educational system that was predisposing them to look down upon Ukraine and Ukrainians. And I think that this really brings us collectively back to the significance of cognitive forms of decolonization. And that's what I'm really most interested in, is the cognitive and the intersubjective ways that we can advance our own thinking about about what it means to be under Russian rule, what it means to be Ukrainian. And those processes are already underway in Ukraine. When Russia is no longer controlling Crimea, I think that those processes can start in Crimea, right? The Ukrainian government has a plan for that includes things like social media, the education system, institutions of governance, right? It's very holistic. And so the process of cognitive decolonization can begin when the military occupation ends of Crimea.
An excellent sentiment for us to take away, I think. So if you'll all please join me in saying a big thank you to Greta Uhling, not only for her book, which I do highly recommend, and if you have access to the Harvard's library system, it is open access, so you can read it online for free. If you are on campus, we would like to invite you to this afternoon's event at 4 p.m. in person, reporting on Ukraine, telling the story of a 4-year war, which will be Mary Louise Kelly, Dara Hassanzadeh, and Serhiy Ploukhy, which is co-hosted by the Center for European Studies, Davis Center, and Curie. That's part of our series called The Forum. And then tomorrow, both in person and online, we'll have our very own Serhiy Ploukhy talking about his new book, David and Goliath, Commentaries on the Russo-Ukrainian War. There's more information about all of our events on our website, and the next events in this series will be published there as well. And if you missed anything or want to share the link to this video, it will also be available online. So Greta, thank you so much for your book. Thank you so much for the discussion. Natalia, thanks so much for co-hosting this series with me. It's always great to have such fascinating discussions with all of you. And thanks for everyone who attended.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.